here's what nobody is telling you straight. The same country that America has been sanctioning for funding a war in Ukraine, Russia, is now the country America just gave permission to sell oil to India. Read that again. The Trump administration, after spending nearly a year pressuring India with 50% tariffs to stop buying Russian crude, just issued a 30-day waiver telling New Delhi, go ahead, buy it. Washington's pressure campaign had actually been working. India had sharply reduced its Russian oil purchases in exchange for tariff relief. And then the joint U.S.-Israeli offensive against Iran effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, the waterway through which nearly all Middle Eastern oil flows. And now, this is the part that should make every American paying attention feel deeply uncomfortable. Russia has been providing Iran with information that can help Tehran strike U.S. military targets in the region. Russia is simultaneously helping Iran kill Americans and selling oil to our partners, with Washington's blessing. Before the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran, Russia was forced to sell its oil at a discount of $10 to $13 a barrel. Now it's selling at a premium. The Iran war that America started didn't just destabilize the Middle East, it handed Moscow an economic lifeline it was nearly suffocating without. Indian refiners have purchased nearly 30 million barrels of Russian crude in just the past few days. 30 million barrels in days, while American troops are dodging Russian-supplied intelligence in the Persian Gulf. This is not a foreign policy story. This is a story about contradictions so enormous they collapse under their own weight, and a global power structure reshuffling itself in real time while gas prices climb and Americans foot the bill. So let's back all the way up. Because to understand what is happening right now in real time, you have to understand how we got here. And I promise you, every single turn in this story is more jaw-dropping than the one before it. Go back to last August. The Trump administration was doing something that, on its face, actually made sense strategically. They were pressuring India to stop buying Russian oil. The logic was simple. Trump had slapped India with a punishing 50% tariff, a 25% base rate on top of an additional 25% punitive tariff, specifically because of India's Russian oil purchases. The White House reasoning was that every barrel of Russian crude that India bought was money flowing into Moscow's war chest, money that was keeping Vladimir Putin's military machine running in Ukraine. So the tariff was a financial squeeze, a message to New Delhi: stop funding the enemy. And here's the thing that almost nobody in the American media stopped to fully process. It was actually working. India, one of the largest oil importers on the planet, was genuinely starting to blink. Between December 2025 and February 2026, Russia's share of India's total crude imports fell below 25% for the first time in 2 years, driven by sanctions pressure, tariffs, payment complications, and shipping constraints. Indian refiners were scrambling to find alternative barrels from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE. The architecture of economic pressure that the United States had built around Russian oil was starting to show real results in India. And then, in early February, the two countries struck what both sides were calling a deal. On February the 2nd, Trump announced on social media that Modi had agreed to stop buying Russian oil altogether, to start buying $500 billion worth of American products, and to reduce India's tariffs on U.S. goods to zero. In return, Washington would drop those tariffs on India from 50% down to 18%. Trump called it a trade deal. He called Modi one of my greatest friends. He even claimed on Truth Social that this agreement would help end the war in Ukraine. But here is where the story gets complicated. And if you were paying close attention, you saw the first crack in the deal almost immediately. Modi celebrated the tariff reduction on social media. But he did not once mention stopping Russian oil purchases. He did not confirm the $500 billion buying pledge. He did not confirm reducing India's tariffs to zero. The two men had apparently had a very different phone call, or at least they were describing it very differently to their respective home audiences. Trump was declaring a sweeping geopolitical victory. Modi was simply noting that it was nice to have lower tariffs. And so the question that every analyst and every diplomat who covers South Asia was quietly asking in early February was this: is this deal real? Did India actually commit to abandoning Russian oil? Or did Modi, one of the most experienced strategic non-committal politicians on the planet, simply let Trump have a win while India retained the flexibility to keep doing exactly what India wanted to do? The answer came fast. Within weeks, the Indian government issued a formal statement saying that India had never depended on permission from any country to buy Russian oil, and that Russia remained India's largest crude oil supplier even through February 2026. So that deal that was going to end the Ukraine war and strangle Russia's oil revenues? India never fully signed on to it. Not publicly, not on paper, not in the joint statement. The whole thing had been a diplomatic performance, a handshake and a phone call that one side turned into a press release and the other side quietly filed away as unconfirmed. But then, before any of this could be resolved, before the tariff negotiators could get back to the table, before anyone in Washington could figure out what India had actually promised and what it hadn't, the world changed again. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a joint military strike on Iran. It was the beginning of what would become the largest American military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, involving air, naval, and missile defense assets. Iran responded immediately with missiles and drones aimed at American military installations across the Persian Gulf region and the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical waterways on the entire planet, the narrow passage through which almost a third of the world's seaborne oil travels, was suddenly in the middle of a war zone. Think about what that means for India for a second. Nearly half of India's crude oil imports transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Half. So when Iran started targeting vessels in that strait in retaliation for the American and Israeli strikes, India wasn't just watching a news story. India was watching half of its energy supply chain be threatened in real time. The Saudi barrels that India had been pivoting toward to replace Russian oil, suddenly inaccessible. The Iraqi oil that Indian refiners had contracted, stuck in the Persian Gulf, unable to move. The entire alternative supply chain that the Trump administration had pushed India to build as a replacement for Russian crude was now, through the logic of American foreign policy itself, disrupted. And so Washington did something extraordinary. After spending months threatening India with tariffs and extracting what it claimed was a commitment to stop buying Russian oil, the United States turned around and granted India a 30-day waiver, specifically authorizing Indian refiners to purchase Russian crude because American and Israeli strikes on Iran had cut off Middle Eastern supply. The sanctions that were designed to punish Russia were put on pause, because the war that America started created the very crisis that made those sanctions impossible to sustain. Indian refiners moved with breathtaking speed. Indian Oil Corporation and Reliance Industries each purchased around 10 million barrels in just a matter of days, snapping up all available Russian crude on the spot market, a total of roughly 30 million barrels, equivalent to India's entire monthly import intake. Much of that oil had been sitting on tankers floating in Asian waters, unsold, because of the previous sanctions pressure and India's earlier pullback from the Russian market. The moment the waiver was issued, those tankers found buyers. The Russian oil that had been piling up with no place to go was suddenly worth rushing to offload. And this is the part that should make every American watching this absolutely furious, not at India, which is simply making rational energy decisions under extraordinary pressure, but at the logic of the whole situation. In 2 weeks, the price of Russian Urals crude jumped from approximately $45 per barrel to around $76 per barrel. The same oil that had been selling at discounts of more than $10 below global benchmarks was now commanding a premium. Russia, which had been financially squeezed, economically isolated, struggling to fund its military operations in Ukraine, Russia just got bailed out. Not by a change in its own strategy, not by some diplomatic breakthrough, but by an American war in the Middle East that America chose to start. Russia had been exporting 80% of its oil to China and India and had been forced to sell at deep discounts to maintain those relationships. Those discounts were the bite of the sanctions, the real economic punishment that was grinding Moscow down. And in 1 week of American military action against Iran, the discount evaporated. The punishment ended. The pressure relief valve that Washington itself had been tightening for 2 years was suddenly released by Washington. Now let's talk about the part of this story that goes beyond economics, because the oil trade is actually the more comfortable conversation. The harder conversation, the one that the Trump administration has been visibly uncomfortable having, is about what Russia has been doing militarily while this whole oil drama was playing out. According to multiple people familiar with U.S. intelligence reporting, Russia has been providing Iran with detailed intelligence about the locations and movements of American troops, ships, and aircraft throughout the Middle East conflict. Much of the intelligence Russia shared with Iran came from Moscow's sophisticated network of overhead surveillance satellites. Think about what that means. American service members are deployed across the Persian Gulf right now. They are on aircraft carriers, at bases in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Qatar, and Russia, the same country that the Trump administration has been trying to court as a potential partner for a Ukraine ceasefire, the same Putin that Trump has called and spoken with, praised, and defended, that Russia was feeding Iran a real-time picture of where American forces are located. An Iranian drone struck a facility housing U.S. troops in Kuwait, killing 6 American service members. 6 Americans dead, and there is intelligence suggesting that Russian satellite data may have contributed to Iran's ability to locate and strike that position. The Washington Post, CNN, ABC News, and NBC News all reported this. Multiple intelligence officials confirmed it. This was not a fringe claim, not a partisan talking point. This was confirmed, sourced, documented reporting from America's most credible national security correspondents. And the Trump administration's response was to ask Russia nicely if it was true. After the reports broke, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff said that Russian officials had denied the intelligence sharing in a phone call with Trump, and that the administration was prepared to take them at their word. "Let's hope that they're not sharing," Witkoff said. That was the response. That was it. Hope. From the same administration that threatened India with 50% tariffs over its oil choices, the same administration that used economic warfare against an allied democracy for buying discounted crude. When it came to Russia potentially feeding targeting intelligence to Iran, intelligence that may have helped kill Americans, the response was to accept a denial and move on. Trump himself downplayed the reports. If they're getting information, it's not helping them much, he told reporters. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told the press that Russia and China were not really a factor in the Iran conflict. And yet, simultaneously, U.S. intelligence officials were describing Russia's intelligence support to Iran as a pretty comprehensive effort. Those two things cannot both be true at once. Either Russia is a factor or it isn't. Either the intelligence sharing is serious or it isn't. The administration was saying one thing publicly and another thing in classified briefings, and the American people were left to reconcile that contradiction on their own. Russia has condemned the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran as an unprovoked act of armed aggression, and Putin personally reaffirmed what the Kremlin called unwavering support for Tehran and solidarity with Iranian friends. This is not a country that was on the fence. This is not a country that was reluctantly watching from the sidelines. Russia made a clear and public choice. It stood with Iran. It extended its satellite network to help Iran track Americans. It publicly condemned the United States. And at the exact same time, Washington granted Russia's second-largest oil customer a waiver to buy Russian crude, handed Moscow an oil price windfall, and was still in active diplomatic discussions about a Ukraine peace deal that might lift further Russian oil sanctions. Now, pull back for a moment, because there's something deeply important to understand about where India sits in all of this, and what India's behavior tells us about the new architecture of global power. India is not an adversary. India is not a bad actor. India is a rational, sovereign nation with 1.4 billion people, a $4 trillion economy, and energy needs that are enormous and non-negotiable. When the Indian government says it does not need permission from any country to buy its oil, that is not defiance for its own sake. That is a simple statement of economic reality. India has to keep its refineries running. India has to keep its economy moving. And in a world where the Strait of Hormuz is closed, where Middle Eastern supply chains are disrupted, where American military choices have created an energy crisis, India will buy the oil that is available, affordable, and deliverable. What this moment reveals is that the world's so-called sanctions architecture, the Western effort to financially squeeze Russia through energy markets, has a fundamental flaw built into its foundation. From the beginning of sanctions in 2022 through February 2026, India purchased 37% of all Russian crude exports, while China purchased 48%. The two largest alternative markets for Russian oil were never fully on board with Western sanctions strategy. And the moment any disruption hits traditional supply chains, those markets don't shrink, they expand. The sanction pressure eases, the leverage disappears. And Russia knew this. Russia has always known this. Russia's entire post-sanctions energy strategy was built on the assumption that China and India would absorb what Europe no longer would. By the end of 2025, 80% of all Russian oil exports were flowing to just those two countries. Moscow had retooled its entire export infrastructure around that reality. It built payment systems that bypassed the dollar. It redirected pipelines. It developed the shadow tanker fleet. It built redundancy into every choke point that Western sanctions tried to exploit. And then, when an American war in the Middle East suddenly made Russian oil the most accessible and affordable crude on the market, Russia was perfectly positioned to supply it. So here is the honest, complete, uncomfortable picture of where we are right now. The United States launched a war against Iran that disrupted Middle Eastern oil supply. That disruption forced Washington to grant India a waiver to buy Russian oil. That waiver sent 30 million barrels of Russian crude to Indian refiners in less than a week. That surge in demand pushed Russian oil prices up dramatically, handing Moscow a financial windfall at the exact moment it most needed one. And while all of that was happening, Russia was using its satellite intelligence network to help Iran track and potentially strike American forces that were there because of the war America started. And the American response was to accept Russia's denial and say essentially that it hoped things would work out. This is not a foreign policy story with a clean villain and a clear hero. This is a story about a world that is moving faster than the frameworks designed to manage it. It is a story about sanctions that contain contradictions, about alliances that contain contradictions, about a war that, in the process of trying to project American power, may have handed America's adversaries a significant strategic and economic gift. India didn't betray America. India is just watching out for India. Russia didn't break any new rules. It played by the rules of geopolitical self-interest that great powers have always played by. And the United States, the most powerful country in the history of the world, is standing in the middle of all of it, trying to manage contradictions that it helped create, making arguments that don't fully add up, and asking the American people to trust that whoever is in charge has a plan. Whether there is a plan, that is the question we are all going to be living with for the foreseeable future.